The air inside the rehearsal hall felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. It was 2 days before the biggest night of the year. The grand gala at Carnegie Hall was the kind of event that musicians dreamed about for their entire careers. It was the night where critics from all over the world would sit in the audience with their pens ready to judge. But today, nobody was dreaming. They were panicking. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of nervous silence where nobody dared to breathe too loudly. The news had hit the orchestra like a ton of bricks just 10 minutes earlier. The story of Dmitri, their lead violinist, had spread through the room fast. It was a freak accident, something you wouldn't even believe in a movie. A glass shower door in his hotel room had exploded while he was closing it. The shards had gone everywhere, but the worst part was what happened to his left hand. The tendons were severed. He was in the emergency room right now, and the doctors weren't sure if he would ever hold a bow, let alone play a violin again for the orchestra. This was a complete disaster. Dmitri wasn't just a player. He was the star. He was the one who was supposed to play the solo in the centerpiece of the night, the Symphony of Sorrow. This piece was famous for being nearly impossible. It wasn't just fast. It was emotionally exhausting. It required the soloist to play for 30 minutes without stopping, with notes that went so high they almost squeaked and so low they rumbled the floorboards. It demanded a player who was technically perfect, someone with nerves of steel. The maestro, an older man named Vance with wild white hair, stood in the center of the room. He was holding his conductor's baton like it was a weapon. The director of the symphony board was on the phone in the corner, shouting about cancellation, but Vance wasn't listening. He walked to the front of the orchestra and raised his hands for silence. He looked tired. He looked angry, but underneath that he looked desperate. "We are not canceling," he said. His voice was rough but loud enough for everyone to hear. "But maestro," a man from the brass section spoke up, looking terrified. "Dmitri plays the solo. That piece is a monster. Without him, we have no soloist. We have to cancel. We can't do it." "We do not cancel," Vance repeated, his eyes narrowing. "I have waited 20 years to play this piece in this hall. The audience is coming. They expect a miracle. We will give them one." The musicians looked at each other with wide eyes. The Symphony of Sorrow was not something you could just sight read. It was the kind of music that took months to master. The other players in the violin section were good, sure. They were professionals. But they knew their limits. The first chair violinist, the concertmaster, was already stressed out trying to keep the section together because the maestro had been so busy with Dmitri. There was no way he could learn the solo in 48 hours. "Maestro." Vance stepped off the podium and started to walk through the rows of musicians. This was unusual. He usually stayed in the center, commanding from his spot. He walked past the flutes, ignoring their worried faces. He walked past the cellos, shaking his head slightly when they made eye contact. He was hunting. He was looking for a specific kind of desperation, a specific kind of talent that he knew was hiding somewhere. He stopped in front of the first chair violin. The concertmaster looked up, his face pale. The maestro looked at him, studying him for a moment, then shook his head. "You need to lead the section," Vance said quietly. "I need a soloist. Someone who has nothing to lose." He kept walking. The tension in the room was unbearable. Nobody wanted to be picked. Being picked right now felt like being handed a gun with one bullet and being told to play Russian roulette in front of thousands of people. If you failed, you would ruin your reputation forever. If you failed, you would ruin the maestro's night. The pressure was crushing. At the very back of the second violin section sat a young woman. She was so quiet that most people forgot she was there. Her name was Elena. She was young, recently out of school, and just happy to have a job. She spent most of her days trying to play perfectly so that nobody would notice her. In an orchestra, blending in is a good thing. You don't want to stick out. You want to be part of the sound. Adding to the texture without being the center of attention, Elena kept her head down, staring at her sheet music. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought the person next to her might hear it. She felt like if she made eye contact with the maestro, he might actually see her, and that was the last thing she wanted. She knew the piece, of course. She had listened to it 1,000 times. She had practiced the hard parts in her bedroom at night just for fun, imagining what it would be like to stand in the spotlight and make the instrument sing, but imagining it in an empty apartment and doing it in Carnegie Hall were two very different things. Vance walked all the way to the back of the room. The silence was so loud now that it felt heavy in everyone's ears. He stopped right in front of Elena. She didn't look up. She focused intensely on a dot of ink on the paper in front of her, praying he would just keep walking. "Elena," Vance said. She froze. Her bow stopped moving. Slowly she lifted her head. The maestro was looking down at her. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was intense. He looked like he was staring right through her soul, seeing things she didn't want anyone to see. Double quotes. "Yes, maestro," she whispered. Her voice shook, and she hated herself for it. "Stand up," he commanded. She stood up. Her legs felt like jelly. She felt 60 pairs of eyes turning to look at her. The concertmaster turned around in his chair, his face full of pity. The trumpet players stopped polishing their instruments. Everyone was looking at the girl from the back row who nobody really knew. "You are taking the solo," Vance said. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a second, Elena couldn't breathe. She thought maybe she had misheard him. Maybe he said, "You are taking a break," or "You are taking a seat," but the look in his eyes told her he was serious. But I'm second chair," she stammered, her voice barely audible. I haven't practiced it with the orchestra. I don't have the music memorized for the solo part." "I know what you are," Vance said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "I have heard you playing after hours when everyone else goes home. I have heard you in the hallway. I know you can play the notes. The question is, do you have the guts?" The room was dead silent. This was the moment that could break her career before it even started. The most difficult piece of the entire season, the piece that had crippled lesser musicians, was being handed to her. It wasn't a gift. It was a test. It was a burden that weighed 1,000 tons. Elena looked around the room. She saw the skepticism in the eyes of the older players. She saw the fear. They didn't think she could do it. She looked back at the maestro. She knew that saying no wasn't an option. If she said no, the concert would be canceled. The maestro's dream would die, and the orchestra would fail. She thought about all the nights she spent alone in her room, playing until her fingers hurt. Wishing for a chance that she thought would never come, she swallowed hard, trying to find some moisture in her dry throat. She gripped her violin, feeling the wood warm against her hand. "It was her anchor. I will try," she said softly. "No," Vance said, turning his back and walking back toward the podium. "Don't try. Do it." He stepped up to the podium and raised his baton, his energy shifting instantly. "From the beginning," he shouted. "And Elena? Play like your life depends on it. Because for tonight it does." The girl from the back row took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a split second to gather her courage, and then lifted her violin to her chin. She was terrified. She was invisible no more. She had 48 hours to learn a lifetime of music. And nobody, not even her, could believe what was about to happen next. The silence that followed the maestro's command was heavy, pressing against Elena's chest like a physical weight. For a moment, nobody moved. The air in the vast rehearsal hall felt thick and sticky. Then slowly the sound of shuffling feet and rustling paper returned. The musicians were exchanging glances, not the kind of glances filled with hope, but the kind people give when they are watching a car accident in slow motion. They pitied her. They were terrified for her, and perhaps even a little bit angry at the maestro for putting the entire night in the hands of someone who usually sat in the back row. Elena's heart was hammering, so hard she could hear a rhythmic thumping in her ears. She gripped her violin tighter, her knuckles turning white. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Soloists were discovered in competitions or after years of playing small concerts and slowly building a reputation. They weren't plucked from obscurity 2 days before the biggest show of the year because someone else broke a glass door. It felt unfair, not just to her but to the music. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. It felt like walking to the edge of a cliff. The distance from her chair in the second violin section to the soloist podium in the center of the room was only about 20 feet, but it felt like 20 miles. With every step, she felt the eyes of 50 professional musicians burning into her back. These were people she looked up to, people she had listened to from afar. Now, they were her backup band, and she was the one supposed to lead them. When she finally reached the spot in the center of the semicircle, the floorboards seemed to creak louder than usual. She turned around to face the orchestra. It was a terrifying sight. From the back row, the orchestra looked like a unified wall of sound. From the center, she saw faces. She saw the trumpet player wiping sweat from his brow. She saw the flautist looking down at her shoes. She saw the concertmaster, the leader of the violins, staring at her with a mixture of skepticism and concern. He didn't think she could do it. She could see it in his eyes. He thought she was going to crash and burn, and that they would all go down with her. Maestro Vance raised his baton. He didn't give a speech. He didn't offer any words of encouragement. He just looked at her, lifted his arms, and the music began. The opening chords of the Symphony of Sorrow are not loud. They are soft, weeping notes that pull the listener in immediately. The cellos started, creating a deep, dark bed of sound. Then the violins joined in. Elena lifted her bow to the strings. She knew the first note. She had played it 1,000 times in her bedroom. But as her bow touched the string, her hand shook. Just a tiny twitch. It was enough to make the note wobble. It wasn't a clean start. It sounded like a gasp instead of a cry. The maestro didn't stop. He kept the orchestra going. Elena fought to catch up, her fingers flying over the fingerboard. She was playing the notes, technically speaking. She was hitting the right pitches at the right time. But it wasn't music. It was just noise. It was mechanical, stiff, and terrified. She was so focused on not making a mistake that she forgot to feel anything. She forgot to breathe. The piece requires the soloist to be the voice of the music. The violin is supposed to sing, to scream, to whisper. But Elena was holding back. She was terrified of being heard, terrified of taking up space. Her sound was thin, barely cutting through the wall of sound behind her. It felt like she was trying to shout while underwater. About 10 minutes into the rehearsal, they reached a section known as the storm. This was where the music got fast and aggressive. The orchestra played loud, crashing chords. Elena was supposed to play a dizzying run of notes that soared above the chaos. She brought her bow down, gritting her teeth, trying to force the sound out of the instrument. She made a mistake. A squeak, a high-pitched, ugly sound that cut through the harmony like a knife. "Stop!" The baton slammed against the music stand. The music died instantly. The silence that rushed back in was even worse than before. It was the silence of failure. Elena dropped her bow to her side, her face burning hot with shame. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. She wanted to run back to her apartment, hide under the covers, and never take her violin out of its case again. Maestro Vance stepped down from the podium. He walked slowly toward her. He didn't look angry this time. He looked disappointed. "That was worse. You are playing like a mouse," he said, his voice low so the orchestra wouldn't hear, though they were all listening anyway. "Where is the fire? Where is the pain? This piece is called the Symphony of Sorrow, not the Symphony of Being Afraid to Make a Mistake." "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm trying my best." "Your best is not good enough," Vance said sharply. "This is Carnegie Hall. Nobody cares about your best. They care about the music. And right now, you are killing it." He turned to the orchestra. "Take 10 minutes," he shouted. "Elena, stay there." The musicians put down their instruments and stood up, stretching and talking in hushed whispers. Elena stood alone in the center of the room, clutching her violin. She felt like she was standing in the middle of a giant empty room. Naked and exposed, the maestro walked up close to her, looking her in the eye. Why did I choose you, Elena? He asked. She didn't know what to say. I... I don't know. I chose you because I heard you play in the hallway last month. You were playing a folk song, a simple little tune, but you played it like your heart was breaking. That is the sound we need here. I don't need a robot. I have plenty of robots in this orchestra. I need a human being who understands what it means to lose something. He reached out and gently tapped the top of her violin. But today you are playing like you are scared of the instrument. You are scared of the music. You cannot lead us if you are looking at your feet. You have to look up. You have to scream. I can't scream, Elena said, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. I'm just a second violinist. I'm used to blending in. I don't know how to be out here alone. Vance sighed a long, tired exhale. Then you better learn fast. Because in 40 hours you are going to walk out on that stage and there will be nowhere to hide. If you play like a mouse, the audience will eat you alive. You have to find a reason to play this piece. You have to find something inside you that hurts. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. Elena felt a lump in her throat. She looked around the hall. The musicians were standing in groups, drinking coffee or checking their phones. They were avoiding looking at her. She was the problem now. She was the reason the rehearsal wasn't working. She could feel the resentment starting to build. They were thinking, why did he pick her? She's ruining the show. When the break ended, the rehearsal continued, but it was a nightmare. The maestro stopped every few bars. He critiqued her timing, her tone, her posture. Nothing she did was right. She was shaking so badly by the end that she could barely hold the bow. The Symphony of Sorrow felt like a mountain she was trying to climb with her bare hands, and she was slipping down to the bottom every time she moved. Finally, after 2 agonizing hours, the maestro lowered his arms for the last time. That is enough for today, he said. He didn't say, good job. He didn't say, see you tomorrow. He just picked up his scores and walked off the stage without a backward glance. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. People started packing up their instruments quickly. They wanted to leave. They wanted to get away from the awkward, heavy tension that hung over the solo podium. Elena stood there for a moment, frozen. She felt like she was going to vomit. She had never been so humiliated in her entire life. She had spent her whole life trying to be perfect, to be invisible, to be reliable. And now, in just a few hours, she had become the girl who couldn't play. Slowly, she walked back to her chair in the second violin section. The chair next to hers was empty. She put her violin in its case, her fingers fumbling with the latches because they were still trembling. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't say goodbye to the stand partner she had played next to for 6 months. She just clicked the case shut, hoisted it over her shoulder, and walked toward the exit. As she walked out of the rehearsal hall and into the cool evening air of the city, the reality of the situation hit her. She had to go back tomorrow. She had to do it all again. And in 2 days, she had to step onto the biggest stage in the world and prove that she wasn't a mouse. She hailed a taxi, climbed into the back seat, and gave the driver her address. As the city lights blurred past the window, Elena put her head in her hands. She felt completely alone. The weight of the symphony, the maestro's expectations, and the orchestra's doubt were all crushing down on her. She didn't know if she could do it. In fact, for the first time in her life, she was pretty sure she couldn't. She was just a girl from the back row, and she had no idea how to find the voice the maestro wanted her to have. Elena's apartment was very small. It was on the 4th floor of an old building with a broken elevator, which meant she had to climb the stairs every day. Usually the climb tired her out, but tonight she felt numb. Her legs moved automatically, carrying her heavy violin case up the steps. But her mind was still back in that rehearsal hall, hearing the sound of her own failure echoing in her ears. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence of the empty room welcomed her. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt lonely. The apartment was messy, with sheet music scattered on the table and a half-empty cup of cold tea sitting on the counter. Elena put her violin case on the bed and sat down next to it. She didn't open it immediately. She just sat there, staring at the wall, feeling a heavy lump in her throat. The rehearsal had been a disaster. She could still see the look on the maestro's face when he told her she was playing like a mouse. She could hear the irritation in his voice. Worst of all, she could feel the judgment of the other musicians. They knew she didn't belong there. She knew it too. "I should just call him," she whispered to the empty room. Her voice sounded weak and small. "I should tell him I quit. I should tell him to find someone else." But she knew there was no one else. The concertmaster was too busy. The other players were too scared. If she quit, the symphony would be canceled. The maestro's big night would be ruined. She didn't want to be the reason for that. With a heavy sigh, she reached over and clicked open the latches of her violin case. She lifted the instrument out, admiring the warm, orange glow of the wood under the lamplight. It was a beautiful violin, older than she was, but it wasn't a fancy soloist instrument. It was made for blending in, just like her. She picked up her bow and tightened it. Then she took the sheet music for the Symphony of Sorrow and propped it up on the music stand. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and started to play. She tried to play it the way Dmitri would have. She tried to make the notes big, loud, and powerful. She pushed the bow into the strings with all her strength, forcing the sound out. But it sounded terrible. The violin screeched. The tone was harsh and ugly. She was fighting the instrument, and the instrument was fighting back. She stopped, her arm aching. Tears of frustration began to well up in her eyes. She played the phrase again, and again. Each time it felt wrong. It was like she was trying to wear shoes that were 3 sizes too big. She was walking, but she couldn't move. She played until her fingers actually started to hurt. She looked down at her left hand. The tips of her fingers were red and raw. There was even a tiny spot of blood on the string. She wiped it away with her shirt, feeling a wave of despair wash over her. "I can't do this," she said, dropping the bow onto the bed. "I'm not strong enough. I'm not a soloist." She stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the city lights. It was late. Most people were asleep. She felt completely isolated, like a tiny boat lost in a giant ocean. She turned away from the window and walked back to her bed, ready to put the violin away and admit defeat. But as she reached for the case, she accidentally knocked her folder of old sheet music off the table. Papers scattered everywhere. Elena sighed, cursing under her breath, and knelt down to pick them up. It was a mess of old etudes and folk songs she had collected over the years. At the bottom of the pile, caught between 2 pages of an old book, was a thin, yellowed envelope. It was stuck inside a used copy of the symphony score she had bought at a dusty second-hand shop years ago, back when she was still a student. She had never noticed it before. Curious, she pulled the envelope out. It was brittle, the paper almost crumbling when she touched it. She slid a single, folded piece of paper out of it. It was handwritten, in ink that had turned a deep brown color with age. Elena sat on the floor and turned on the lamp to read it. It wasn't a letter addressed to her, of course. It was a translation of a diary entry written by the composer himself, dated 100 years ago. "My dearest Anna," the letter began. "They tell me this concerto is too difficult. They tell me the technique is impossible. But I am not writing it for the virtuosos in the grand halls. I am writing it for you. I am writing it for the sound of your breathing as you sleep. I am writing it for the smallness of your hands against mine." Elena stopped breathing for a second. She read on, her eyes wide. "You are too weak to play the big chords, my little one. You are too quiet to roar. But your silence is louder than any thunder. This music is not about strength. It is about fragility. It is about the beauty of a flame that flickers but refuses to go out. Do not play it loudly. Play it as if you are saying goodbye. Play it as if every note is a memory you are afraid to forget." Elena let the paper fall onto her lap. Her hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from shock. She felt a sudden chill run down her spine. All this time, she thought the Symphony of Sorrow was a monster. She thought it was about technical perfection, about playing faster and higher than anyone else. That was how Dmitri played it. That was how all the famous players played it. They treated it like a sport, a test of strength, but the composer hadn't written it for strong people. He had written it for his dying daughter, a girl who was weak, a girl who was quiet. He had written it for someone exactly like Elena. The maestro's words came back to her. Asterisk, I chose you because I heard you play a simple folk song like your heart was breaking. Asterisk, she suddenly understood. The reason she was failing was because she was trying to be someone she wasn't. She was trying to be Dmitri. She was trying to be a lion when she was actually a mouse. And for this specific piece, being a mouse wasn't a weakness. It was the whole point. Elena stood up slowly. She picked up her violin, but this time she didn't grip it tightly. She held it gently, almost cradling it like a child. She didn't look at the sheet music. She didn't need to. She knew the notes. She closed her eyes and thought about the letter. She thought about a father saying goodbye to his daughter. She thought about the pain of loving someone. You know you are going to lose. She lifted her bow. The first note came out not as a screech, but as a whisper. It was so quiet that if someone had been standing in the hallway, they might not have heard it. But inside the small apartment, the sound was intense. It was a thin, fragile sound, sharp as a needle. Elena played the opening phrase again. She didn't push the bow. She let the bow float over the strings. The sound wasn't big and booming. It was intimate and heartbreaking. It sounded like a tear rolling down a cheek. She played for hours. She forgot about the technique. She forgot about the fast runs and the high positions. She focused only on the feeling. She played the pain of the letter. She poured her own loneliness into the instrument. She used the fact that she felt small and invisible, turning it into a source of power. The difficult piece wasn't difficult anymore. It felt natural. It felt like the music was finally speaking her language. The violin sang, not with a loud, operatic voice, but with a quiet, desperate cry that went straight to the bone. When she finally stopped, the sun was starting to come up. A pale light was creeping through the window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. Elena's arms were tired, but her heart was pounding with excitement. She looked at her violin in a new way. It wasn't just a tool for her job anymore. It was a voice for the quiet people, a voice for the ones who were usually ignored. She wasn't going to play like Dmitri. She wasn't going to play like a superstar. She was going to play like the girl in the letter. She was going to play like she was saying goodbye. Elena walked over to her phone, which had been sitting on silent all night. There were no messages, no calls. The orchestra had given up on her. The maestro had left her alone to sink or swim. She picked up the phone and stared at it. She didn't call anyone. She didn't need to tell them what she had found. She knew that words wouldn't be enough to explain it. She would have to show them. She carefully packed her violin away, her movements calm and steady for the first time in 2 days. She drank the rest of the cold tea and sat on the edge of her bed. She was exhausted, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. But she felt a strange kind of peace. The fear was still there, hiding in the back of her mind. But now she had a secret weapon. She had the truth about the music. She walked to the mirror and looked at herself. She looked messy. Her hair was tangled, her eyes were red. But when she looked at her reflection, she didn't see a scared second violinist anymore. She saw a soloist. Okay, she whispered to her reflection. Let's go make them listen. The night of the performance had arrived, and the air inside Carnegie Hall was thick with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. The massive auditorium was packed, every seat filled with people wearing expensive clothes and holding glossy programs. They knew the story. The whispers had spread through the crowd like wildfire. The lead soloist was injured, and a nobody from the second violin section was taking his place. Critics were sitting with their pens uncapped, ready to write a scathing review. They expected a train wreck. They expected a young girl to crumble under the pressure of the world's most famous stage. Backstage, the atmosphere was chaotic. Stagehands were rushing around with cables and chairs. Musicians were warming up. The sound of 100 instruments playing different snippets of melody, creating a deafening wall of noise. But Elena stood in a quiet corner away from the crowd. She was dressed in a long black dress that felt unfamiliar on her skin. Her violin was in her hand, ready. For the first time in 2 days, her hands weren't shaking. She felt a strange sense of calm, like the eye of a hurricane. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She was thinking about the letter she had read the night before. She was thinking about the composer's daughter. She wasn't trying to be a superstar. She was just trying to tell a story. The concertmaster walked by, looked at her, and gave a small, tight nod. He didn't smile. He looked like a man preparing for a disaster. Elena nodded back. She didn't need his smile. She had something else now. 5 minutes, people, the stage manager shouted. Elena took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and stepped out of the wings. Walking onto the stage at Carnegie Hall is a feeling unlike any other. The floor is ancient wood that creaks slightly under your shoes. The auditorium is shaped like a giant shell, designed to carry sound to the very back row. As she walked to the center podium, the lights hit her. They were blindingly bright. She couldn't see the audience. She couldn't see their doubting faces or their frowns. All she could see was a wall of light. It felt like she was walking into a different world, alone. She reached the center. She placed her sheet music on the stand, though she barely needed to look at it. She tuned her violin quickly, the sharp ping of the strings cutting through the murmuring crowd. The murmuring died down. Everyone was watching her. Maestro Vance walked onto the podium. The applause was polite but short. It wasn't the roar of excitement they usually gave a famous soloist. It was the applause of obligation. Vance looked at the crowd, then he turned to Elena. He didn't give her a thumbs up or a nod. He just looked at her, waiting. He was watching to see if the mouse from the rehearsal was still there, or if someone else had taken her place. He raised his arms. The room went completely silent. He brought his baton down. The orchestra began the introduction. It was dark, low, and heavy. The cellos groaned, the basses rumbled. The sound filled the hall like a rising storm. Then the moment came. The music paused, hanging in the air, waiting for the soloist to enter. Elena lifted her bow. She didn't attack the strings. She didn't try to prove she was strong. She simply drew the bow across the string. The sound that came out was so soft that the people in the front row leaned forward, wondering if their ears were playing tricks on them. It wasn't a sound of power. It was a sound of incredible fragility. It was a whisper. It sounded like a memory of a voice that was long gone. The audience expected a loud, technical display. Instead, they got a confession. As Elena played, the quality of the silence in the room changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was attentive. People stopped looking at their programs. They stopped shifting in their seats. The sound was so thin and pure that it seemed to cut right through the air and settle in their chests. She played the first movement not with speed, but with a heartbreaking tenderness. She let the notes breathe. She lingered on the sad parts just a fraction of a second longer than written, squeezing every drop of emotion out of them. The musicians behind her were surprised. They knew this music by heart, but they had never heard it like this. They stopped playing autopilot and started listening to her. They began to adjust their sound to match hers, softening their volume, wrapping their instruments around her fragile melody. They weren't just accompanying her anymore. They were supporting her. As the piece moved into the faster, more difficult sections, the technical challenge was still there. Her fingers had to fly across the wood, hitting tiny notes with perfect precision. But even in the fast runs, she kept the emotion. She didn't sound like a machine gun. She sounded like a rushing wind. By the time she reached the slow movement in the middle, the entire hall was hypnotized. The music soared up into the highest register of the violin. Most players played this part loudly, showing off the brilliance of the instrument. Elena played it softly. It sounded like a plea, like a child asking a question that had no answer. The sound was so piercing that it brought tears to the eyes of the woman in the 10th row. The man next to her stopped breathing. In the box seats, the critics put down their pens. They forgot they were supposed to be judging. They forgot about the lead violinist who had cut his hand. They were just listening, transported somewhere else entirely. Maestro Vance watched Elena, his face, usually stern and focused, softened. He saw the change in her. She wasn't the scared girl from the rehearsal anymore. She was standing tall, her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly with the music. She was playing with the pain of the composer's letter, and it was the most beautiful thing he had heard in years. They approached the finale. The music began to build in intensity. The orchestra played louder, the drums rolled, the brass crashed. This was the moment where the soloist was supposed to overpower the orchestra, to scream over the noise. Elena could have forced it. She could have played loud and ugly just to be heard. But she didn't. She played with a different kind of strength. She played with a steady, unwavering tone that rose above the orchestra like a single star in a dark sky. The music wasn't about fighting. It was about enduring. She held the long, high notes with a steady hand, letting them ring out clear and true. The sound was full of an ache that everyone in the room recognized, the ache of losing something you love. She reached the final cadenza, the solo moment at the very end where the orchestra stops playing completely. It was just her, alone in the light. She played the last phrase. It wasn't a showy ending. It was a soft, gentle resolution. She let the bow drift off the string, letting the final note fade into silence until it was barely a whisper in the air. She lowered her violin and stood perfectly still. The baton in the maestro's hand froze. The music was over. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. There was no coughing, no whispering, no rustling of clothes. The entire audience, 2,000 people, sat in stunned silence. They were holding their breaths, afraid that if they let it out, the magic would break. The silence was heavy with the emotion of what they had just heard. It was the kind of silence that doesn't happen often in life, the silence of a shared human experience. Elena stood there, her chest rising and falling, staring out into the darkness. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them. She knew she had done it. She hadn't just played the notes. She had told the truth. And the truth had stopped the world. The silence in the hall held for what felt like a lifetime. Elena stood on the podium, her chest heaving slightly, her violin resting at her side. The bright lights were still shining in her eyes, making it impossible to see the faces of the audience. She felt small and exposed. For a terrifying moment, she thought that the silence meant they hated it. She thought that they were sitting there, stunned by her audacity to play so quietly, preparing to boo her off the stage. Then a single sound broke the stillness. It was the sound of a person standing up quickly. Then another. Then a few more. Suddenly, a wave of noise crashed over the stage. It started as a rumble and then exploded into a deafening roar. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a chaotic, passionate noise. 2,000 people were on their feet at the same time. They were shouting, cheering, and whistling. The sound was so loud that the floorboards seemed to vibrate beneath Elena's feet. Elena blinked, trying to understand what was happening. She turned her head slightly to the left, where the maestro was standing. Maestro Vance was not smiling his usual dry smile. His face was wet with tears. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, but in a good way. He looked relieved. He stepped forward and grabbed Elena's hand, lifting it high in the air. She flinched, shy and unused to the attention, but he held her firm. He turned her to the front of the stage, then to the sides, presenting her to the cheering crowd like a precious jewel. The applause didn't stop. It went on for minutes. Usually, after a solo, the orchestra gets ready for the next piece. But there was no next piece. This was the end. The musicians in the orchestra stood up too. Even the skeptical trumpet player and the stern concertmaster were clapping, looking at Elena with genuine awe. They knew, better than anyone in the audience, exactly how hard that piece was. They knew she had just done the impossible. Elena looked out into the darkness, and for the first time, she didn't feel like hiding. A strange warmth spread through her chest. She realized that she wasn't the girl from the back row anymore. She had connected with them. She had spoken to them through the violin, and they had understood. Eventually, Maestro Vance gently pushed her toward the edge of the stage. "Go," he whispered. We are done here. Elena walked off the stage, her legs feeling wobbly. As soon as she stepped into the dark wings of the backstage area, the noise of the hall faded slightly, replaced by the frantic activity of the crew. A stagehand handed her a bouquet of flowers. She stared at them, confused, as if she didn't know what they were for. Then she was surrounded. First came the other violinists. They weren't aloof anymore. They were hugging her, some of them with tears in their eyes. The concertmaster, a man she had always feared and respected, grabbed her shoulders. I was wrong, he said, his voice loud and firm over the noise. I was so wrong. That was beautiful. You saved us, Elena. Before she could respond, the maestro appeared. He was wiping his face with a handkerchief. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him smile, a real, warm smile. He didn't say anything about the technique or the notes. He just pulled her into a bear hug, crushing the flowers against her chest. Exactly what I heard in the hallway, he whispered into her ear. Thank you. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She realized she was crying too. She wasn't crying because she was sad, and she wasn't crying because she was scared. She was crying because she felt accepted. She had spent her whole life trying to be invisible, and tonight she had been seen, truly seen, by the people she admired most, but the night wasn't over. While the orchestra was packing up their instruments and changing out of their concert black, a commotion started near the backstage door. A man was trying to get past the security guards. He was older, with gray hair and a coat that looked too expensive for the dusty backstage area. It was Julian Vogel. He was the most famous music critic in the country. He was known as the Butcher because his reviews were so harsh that they had ended careers. Musicians were terrified of him. The guards stopped him, but he waved a press pass and pointed toward Elena. Let me through, he demanded. I need to speak to her. Elena froze. The fear came rushing back. This was it. He was going to tell her that the performance was a fluke. He was going to say that she was too emotional, too quiet. She gripped her violin case tightly, wanting to run. The man approached her. He didn't have a notebook. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were intense. He looked at her for a long moment. The musicians around them went quiet, watching nervously. I have reviewed this symphony 12 times, Vogel said, his voice low and gravelly. I have heard the greatest players in the world play it. Usually it sounds like a sport. It sounds like someone showing off how fast their fingers can move. Elena nodded slightly, unsure of what to say. But tonight, the critic continued, stepping closer, you didn't play the notes. You played the soul. I forgot I was a critic. I forgot I was supposed to judge you. I remembered what it feels like to lose something. He reached out and gently took her hand. Unlike the firm grip of the musicians, his touch was light, almost reverent. You didn't just perform tonight, young lady, he said. You reminded us why music exists. And that is a very, very dangerous thing to do. Because now you have set the bar so high that you can never come back down? He kissed her hand. An old-fashioned gesture that surprised everyone, and then turned and walked away. Leaving Elena standing there with her mouth slightly open, over the next few days, what happened was truly unbelievable. The recording of the performance, made by a single microphone in the hall for radio broadcast, was leaked onto the internet. It didn't just get a few listens. It went viral instantly. Millions of people listened to it. It wasn't just classical music fans. It was everyone. Teenagers, construction workers, grandmothers. They shared the audio, talking about the silence, the softness, and the heartbreak they heard in her playing. The headline of the New York Times the next morning read, *The mouse that roared, a night Carnegie will never forget. Offers poured into Elena's tiny apartment. Major orchestras in London, Berlin, and Tokyo wanted her to be their soloist. Record labels wanted to sign her. Television shows wanted to interview her. Her life changed in a heartbeat. She didn't have to climb the stairs to her apartment worrying about the rent anymore. She was famous, but the most unbelievable change wasn't the money or the fame. It was how she felt when she picked up her violin. A week later, Elena was packing her bags for a tour. She looked around her small, messy apartment one last time. She saw the spot on the floor where she had found the old letter. She thought about the composer's daughter. The girl who was too weak to play loud. Elena realized that she wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She had become the voice for all the quiet people in the world. She had proven that you didn't have to be the loudest person in the room to be heard. You just had to be true. She put her violin in its case, but this time she didn't treat it like a heavy burden. She treated it like an old friend. She walked out the door, her head held high. The girl who used to sit in the back row, terrified of being noticed, was finally ready to take her place in the spotlight, not as a fake, but as a true artist. And as she stepped into the waiting car to go to the airport, she smiled, knowing that the most difficult piece of her life was finally, beautifully, complete.